The cold January night pressed against the small, weathered animal shelter in the heart of rural Pennsylvania. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending the occasional gust of ice-cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls. The rain had been falling for hours, dark clouds hanging heavily in the sky like a curtain drawn across the stars. Inside, the shelter was just as bleak, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering above, casting long, harsh shadows across the rows of metal cages. The usual sounds of barking and whining echoed throughout the building, a cacophony of voices yearning for attention, for affection, for a second chance. But in the far corner of the shelter, in the furthest cage from the light, there was only silence. Shadow, a once proud German shepherd, lay motionless on the cold concrete floor of his cage, his eyes dull and tired, his fur matted and dirty. At just 8 years old, Shadow's life had already been long and full. He had served for years as a highly trained K-9 officer, alongside his handler, Officer Jack Riley, helping to track down criminals and saving lives in ways most people could only dream of. Shadow had been more than a partner. He had been family. But age had caught up with him. Arthritis had taken its toll, leaving him stiff and sore, unable to perform the tasks that had once been second nature to him. The day came when Jack had to make the heartbreaking decision to retire Shadow, sending him to the shelter, a place Shadow had never known. Now, months later, Shadow lay there, forgotten by most, his body weary and broken. No one had come for him. The shelter's policy was clear. If a dog wasn't adopted within a certain amount of time, it was put on the euthanasia list. And now, Shadow's time was running out. Tomorrow, he would be taken to the back room. His cage door would close behind him, and he would never walk again. No more patrols, no more chasing down criminals, no more partnerships. Just the cold, quiet end that came for too many like him. But that night something happened. A sound cut through the usual hum of the shelter. At first, it was faint, just a small whimper, a tiny cry of discomfort. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more intense. It was a howl, a mournful, sorrowful cry that filled the room with a pain so deep, it seemed to reach into the very soul of anyone who heard it. Lisa, the young shelter assistant, froze mid-step as the howl echoed through the hallway. She had spent weeks observing Shadow, watching him from afar as he had become a shell of the strong dog he once was. She had seen the way his eyes would flicker toward the door when other dogs were adopted, the way he would lift his head ever so slightly when someone walked past his cage, as if he were silently pleading for a chance. But this howl, this was different. It wasn't just a sound of longing or fear. It was a cry of a broken soul. Lisa's heart caught in her throat. She had tried to keep her distance. After all, there were too many animals here to focus on just one. But Shadow's howl was like a siren call, a cry that could no longer be ignored. She knew what that sound meant. It meant Shadow was ready to give up. It meant he had accepted that his time was coming, that he had no more fight left in him. But as Lisa stood frozen in the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. She felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward his cage, as though the sound was calling her to do something, to act. Lisa hurried down the narrow corridor, her breath catching in her chest with each step. The door to Shadow's cage was just ahead. She could hear the desperate, mournful cry growing louder, and when she reached it, she didn't even hesitate. She swung open the door and crouched down beside Shadow's cage. The German shepherd lay there, his fur matted, his eyes dull and tired. But as Lisa approached, something changed. His head lifted, ever so slowly, and his amber eyes met hers. There was a recognition in those eyes, a spark that still flickered despite the years of pain and loneliness. Lisa swallowed hard. She had heard the stories of dogs like Shadow, dogs that had been discarded after years of loyal service. She had seen the looks of pain in their eyes, the vacant stares, the silent acceptance of their fate. But there was something about Shadow that was different. He wasn't just any dog. He had been a hero, a protector. He had stood alongside his handler through some of the most dangerous situations, and now, here he was, waiting to be forgotten. "Hey, buddy," Lisa whispered, her voice soft and soothing. She reached through the bars of the cage and placed a hand gently on his head. "You don't belong here. Not like this." For a moment, Shadow's eyes held hers, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Lisa saw something in his gaze. It wasn't just the weariness or the sorrow. It was hope, a faint, fragile glimmer of hope. Shadow wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. But time was running out. Tomorrow, the shelter would make a final decision. Would Shadow's past as a decorated K9 be enough to change his fate? Or would his age and deteriorating health seal his end? Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, making a promise in her mind that she wasn't sure she could keep. She wasn't going to let this be the end for Shadow. Not if she could help it. Lisa stood there for a moment, her hand gently resting on Shadow's head as she looked into his tired eyes. She could feel the weight of his years and the depth of his longing. It wasn't just his body that was worn out. It was his spirit. Shadow had given so much of himself, and now, after everything, he was on the brink of being discarded. The harsh reality of it twisted in her gut. It wasn't right. The shelter was underfunded, overpopulated, and had its own set of rules to follow, most of which had nothing to do with the dogs' histories or the loyalty they had shown in their past lives. Lisa had been working at the shelter for almost a year now, and in that time, she had seen more than her share of animals surrendered, abandoned, or left behind. But there was something about Shadow that dug deeper than any of the others. He wasn't just any dog. He had been a K9, a soldier of sorts, fighting beside his human partner, Jack, for years. He had sacrificed so much, his health, his strength, his youth, for a job he never once questioned. And now, he was being treated like any other unwanted stray. Lisa had read through his file when he was first brought in. She knew the basics. The dog had been a dedicated working partner to Officer Jack Riley, saving lives and facing dangers most people could never imagine. She knew that Shadow had been forced into retirement after an injury that rendered him unfit for duty. The injury had affected his joints, and over time, his health had steadily deteriorated. His once sharp senses were dulled, and his body was now burdened with the toll of years of service. But what Lisa hadn't known, what she hadn't truly understood, was how much of himself Shadow had given. The thought made her chest tighten. It wasn't fair. Shadow had been through too much to be forgotten like this. He deserved better. She heard the faint sound of other dogs barking in the distance, the noise of their restlessness creeping through the walls. They were all just waiting for a chance at adoption, a new home, a future. But for some dogs, like Shadow, that chance was fleeting. Time had a way of running out, and for the older, less adoptable ones, the end came quickly. Lisa took a deep breath and slowly stood up. She stepped back, not because she wanted to leave Shadow, but because she needed to think. Shadow's time at the shelter had been long, too long. The shelter was always filled to capacity, and there were no guarantees. It wasn't just the dogs that had to wait for their fate. It was the people too. She had to face the reality of the situation. The shelter's policy was clear. If Shadow wasn't adopted by the end of the week, he would be put down. Lisa's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She turned to see the shelter director, Margaret Evans, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her face set in a stern expression. Margaret was the backbone of the shelter, a woman who had long given up on the idealistic notion of saving every animal. She ran things with an iron fist, sticking to the rules and regulations no matter how difficult the decisions were. "I told you, Lisa," Margaret began, her voice calm but unyielding. "Shadow's time is almost up. The euthanasia list is final." Lisa felt her stomach twist. "But Margaret, he's a retired K9 officer. He has years of service behind him. We can't just end it here. He deserves—" No, Margaret's tone was sharp, cutting through Lisa's words. "I get it. He's been a hero. But the fact is, we have more dogs than we have space for, and we're running out of resources. He's not the only one here who's been through hell. Every dog here has a story, Lisa. You know that. We have to make tough choices." Lisa could feel the sting of Margaret's words, but she refused to back down. She had seen dogs get adopted. She had seen them go to good homes. And she knew it wasn't just the shelter's policy that was driving this decision, it was the circumstances. But that didn't make it right. She could feel Shadow's eyes on her, silently pleading. He had served his time, his duty. He had given everything, and now it was time for someone to stand up for him. "I'm not asking for an exception," Lisa said, her voice trembling slightly. "But Shadow deserves a chance. I can't just let him die here." Margaret's eyes softened for just a moment before hardening again. "Lisa, I know you're attached, but you can't save them all. It's out of our hands now." With that, Margaret turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Lisa stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The world around her seemed to close in. The walls felt like they were getting tighter, the weight of her thoughts pressing down harder than ever. But she wasn't ready to give up on Shadow. Not when he had given so much. Not when there was still a flicker of hope in his eyes. She walked back to Shadow's cage, where he lay silently, his body still and his eyes half closed. His breathing was slow, labored from age and the physical toll of his former life. But there was something else in his gaze now, a quiet acceptance. He knew what was coming, and yet, in that moment, Shadow lifted his head and looked at her with the same trust he had always given Jack. "Don't worry, buddy," Lisa whispered, kneeling down beside him again. "I won't let them take you." With every ounce of her being, Lisa knew what she had to do. She had to fight, even if it meant taking matters into her own hands. The shelter's rules were one thing, but she wasn't going to let the system dictate Shadow's fate. He had earned the right to live, and she was going to make sure that he did. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed heavily in the sky, as if the world was holding its breath. Lisa arrived at the shelter early, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. Shadow's cage sat at the far end of the shelter, where the dim light barely reached. She walked toward it, the sound of her shoes echoing in the otherwise silent hallway. As she approached, she saw Shadow lying on the cold concrete floor, his body slightly stiff, but there was a small spark of recognition in his eyes when he saw her. His tail gave a faint wag, but the tiredness in his gaze was hard to ignore. Lisa crouched beside him, gently resting her hand on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. "Morning, buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We've got a fight ahead of us." The decision had been made. Lisa had resolved to keep Shadow alive, to fight for him. But she knew the battle wasn't going to be easy. The shelter had a strict policy, and Margaret, the director, was unwavering in her commitment to those policies. Lisa had never gone against Margaret's word before, but something about Shadow's plight felt different. He wasn't just any dog. He had given his all for years as a K-9 officer, and now he deserved a chance to live out his remaining days with dignity. However, it wasn't just the shelter that Lisa had to worry about. The clock was ticking. Shadow's health had been deteriorating rapidly, and the shelter staff had made it clear that he wasn't a priority. Time was something they didn't have. If Lisa couldn't get Shadow out of the shelter and into a home or at least a foster care situation, the euthanasia appointment was inevitable. Lisa spent the next few hours pacing the shelter, thinking of ways to change the course of Shadow's fate. She couldn't afford to keep him there. There were too many other animals with higher adoption chances, too many that didn't have the same history Shadow did. The shelter was filled with dogs that were friendly and young, dogs who were cute and adoptable. Shadow, with his aging joints and his history of service, was a harder sell. Lisa knew she couldn't offer him the comfort and love he deserved if he stayed at the shelter. She had to get him out. But how? By mid-morning, Lisa had made up her mind. She was going to take Shadow to a local vet she trusted, one who had experience with retired K-9s. Maybe, just maybe, a clean bill of health or a plan to manage his medical needs would buy them more time. Time for Lisa to find a foster or adopter who understood the responsibility of caring for a retired working dog. Her first call was to the vet, explaining the situation, the urgency. But even that didn't go smoothly. The vet's office was busy, and they couldn't fit Shadow in until next week. Lisa felt a knot tighten in her chest as she tried to explain the situation. Shadow's time was running out, and waiting a week wasn't an option. Can't you make an exception? Lisa asked, her voice shaky but desperate. This dog he served for years. He's a retired K9, and his time is literally running out. Please, he deserves a chance. The receptionist's voice softened, but there was little they could do. They had a full schedule, and the vet's office couldn't prioritize a case without proper paperwork. Lisa felt a sense of panic rising in her. She had no time left, and everything seemed to be slipping through her fingers. She hung up the phone with a heavy sigh and turned to face Shadow, still lying quietly in his cage. His eyes were open, his body still, but it was clear he didn't have the energy to move. The burden of caring for him, physically, financially, was beginning to feel insurmountable. Lisa had no idea how to make it all work, and as much as she wanted to save him, she could feel the weight of the situation threatening to crush her. But then, just as she was about to lose hope, the shelter's front door swung open. Lisa turned to see a man entering the building, drenched from the rain. His hair was soaked, and his eyes were tired, but there was a determination in his stride. He carried a worn brown envelope in his hand, his expression set with purpose. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? The man stepped into the office area, his voice low, but filled with emotion. "I'm here for Shadow," he said. "My name is Jack Riley. I was his handler." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The man standing before her wasn't just anyone. He was Shadow's former partner, the man who had worked side by side with the German Shepherd for years. She had heard stories of Shadow's past, but she had never met Jack in person. Now he was here, asking to take Shadow home. Her eyes filled with both hope and skepticism. She had fought for Shadow, but she knew the odds were stacked against them. Jack's presence offered a glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness, but there was still so much to work out. Could Jack really offer Shadow the life he deserved? Would he be able to provide the care that the shelter had been unable to give? And would the shelter Margaret allow it? Lisa felt a spark of determination flicker inside her. She knew what had to be done. She wasn't going to let this chance slip away. She could see the desperate love in Jack's eyes, the same devotion that Shadow had once shown him. This was their chance. This was Shadow's chance. "I'll take you to him," Lisa said firmly, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling inside her. She led Jack down the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet building. As they reached Shadow's cage, Jack crouched down, his hands shaking as he reached through the bars, gently touching Shadow's head. The German Shepherd lifted his head slowly, his eyes still tired but filled with recognition. The connection between them was instant, undeniable. It was clear that this wasn't just a reunion. It was a second chance. Shadow, despite his age and frailty, had found his way back to the person who had always been there for him. And Jack, standing there in front of the dog he had once worked beside, knew that he would do whatever it took to make it right. But even with this emotional reunion, the challenge was far from over. They still had to convince the shelter to release Shadow, navigate the logistics of his care, and hope that time wouldn't run out. With every passing moment, the odds seemed to stack higher against them. But for the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope, a chance for Shadow to live out his remaining days with the love and care he had always given. Lisa watched as Jack knelt in front of Shadow's cage, his hands trembling as they brushed over the dog's matted fur. The moment was bittersweet. Shadow, the loyal K9, was finally in the arms of his handler, but Lisa knew the journey ahead was far from easy. The shelter's rules were strict, and Margaret had made it clear that exceptions were not something the shelter made lightly. Even if Jack could provide a home for Shadow, he still had to prove that he could offer the care Shadow needed. But there was another challenge that had yet to be addressed: money. The emotional weight of the situation was heavy, and Lisa found herself caught between her instincts to help and the harsh realities of running a shelter. She had always wanted to save every animal, but the truth was resources were limited. The shelter couldn't just let any dog go without a solid plan in place. They had a reputation to uphold, a budget that didn't have room for exceptions. And Shadow, despite his heroic past, was still just another animal to most of the staff. She turned to Jack, who was still gently stroking Shadow's head, his voice soft as he murmured words of reassurance. The bond between them was undeniable, and Lisa couldn't help but feel a surge of empathy for both of them. She knew Jack's heart was in the right place, but the reality of what was about to happen was still too much to ignore. "I'll go talk to Margaret," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the anxiety twisting in her stomach. Jack looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and desperation. "You think she'll listen?" Jack asked, his voice low. Lisa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll try, but it's not going to be easy." She turned away, heading toward the front office where Margaret sat, hunched over a pile of paperwork. Margaret was the kind of woman who followed the rules without question. She was methodical, pragmatic, and had built the shelter's reputation on doing things by the book. Lisa knew she couldn't argue with Margaret's logic, but there was a part of her that felt Shadow deserved more than a quiet death in the back room. Margaret glanced up when Lisa entered, raising an eyebrow. "Well," she asked, "did you bring him, or are we just wasting time here?" Lisa swallowed hard. "I brought him," she said, taking a deep breath. "But there's something I need to discuss." Margaret's eyes narrowed, sensing the gravity in Lisa's voice. "What now?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Jack," Lisa began, choosing her words carefully. "He's Shadow's handler. He wants to take Shadow home. Give him a place where he can live out his days with someone who knows how to care for him. But there are some things we need to figure out first. Shadow needs specialized care. He's old, his arthritis is severe, and his health is failing. If we're going to let him go, we need to know he'll get the attention he needs." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "And what? You think he'll be able to do that on his own? He's just another person, another dog. The shelter can't be the dog's personal charity. If Jack wants him, fine, but we need guarantees." Lisa felt her pulse quicken. "He'll give him everything he needs, Margaret. Jack's the one who's been with him through thick and thin. Shadow won't get the care he needs anywhere else." Margaret sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "You know how many dogs we have waiting for homes, Lisa. We don't have the luxury to just hand one over because someone feels bad for him." Lisa could feel the weight of Margaret's words pressing down on her. She was fighting not just for Shadow's life, but for the chance to give him dignity in his final days. But the financial realities of the shelter couldn't be ignored. Shadow's care was expensive, and the shelter couldn't afford another failed attempt at rescuing a dog that might never find a permanent home. "There's one more thing," Lisa said, choosing her next words carefully. "Jack doesn't have a lot of money. He's living on freelance work right now, barely scraping by. Shadow's medical bills are high, and we don't know if Jack can cover the costs. But I think we could find a way. Maybe we can raise funds or set up a donation campaign. If Jack is willing to take him, we could give him the chance." Margaret's expression softened just slightly. She knew Lisa was passionate about this, but there was still doubt in her eyes. "I don't know, Lisa. It's a risk. Shadow's health isn't exactly something we can ignore, and if something happens, if Jack can't follow through, you know where that leaves us, right? We can't afford to waste resources." Lisa felt the tension building in her chest. She understood Margaret's hesitation, but it didn't make it any easier. "Please," she said, her voice quieter now. "We can't let him die here. Not after everything he's done. He deserves better." Margaret looked away, staring out the window for a long moment. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, finally, Margaret turned back to Lisa, her expression hard. "I'll give him a week. 1 week to prove that he can handle it. If by the end of the week we don't see progress, he comes back here. Do we have a deal?" Lisa exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much." Margaret nodded curtly. "Just don't come crying to me if things don't work out." Lisa walked out of the office, her heart racing. The hard part was over. Now came the real test. Could Jack really provide for Shadow? Could they raise enough funds for his treatment? And what if, despite everything, Shadow's body couldn't withstand the strain of his age? When Lisa returned to Shadow's cage, she found Jack still sitting by his side. His eyes were full of hope, but the exhaustion was evident in the lines of his face. "We've got a week," Lisa said, her voice steady. "You've got a chance, Jack. Don't waste it. The week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless worries. Lisa spent every moment she could helping Jack, guiding him through the process of caring for Shadow. They were all in, pouring their time, energy, and whatever small resources they could scrape together into making sure Shadow didn't suffer any more than he had to. But with each passing day, the cracks in their plan became more apparent. Jack had found a temporary foster home for Shadow, but money was tight, and the mounting medical bills made every decision feel like walking a tightrope. Shadow, despite the care Jack and Lisa offered, seemed to struggle more than they had anticipated. His arthritis flared up again one evening after a short walk, and his breath became labored. The spark of energy that had kept him going for so long seemed to be dimming, and Jack could feel it. He could feel the weight of every decision. Every second that passed was pushing them closer to the edge. It was late one night when it happened. Jack had been sitting beside Shadow, quietly comforting the dog after another difficult evening. He had given him his medication, fed him, and made sure Shadow was as comfortable as possible. But deep down, he could sense that time was catching up to them. Shadow's strength had always been a beacon for Jack, but now that strength was fading. He could no longer deny the reality. Shadow was aging, and nothing was going to change that. Jack ran his hand through Shadow's fur, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. But as he looked down at the German shepherd, something unexpected happened. Shadow lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jack's. For the first time in days, Shadow's tail gave a weak but unmistakable wag. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The connection between them, the bond that had been forged through years of shared duty, was still there. "Hey, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "You're still with me, huh?" The response wasn't much, just a subtle shift in Shadow's posture. But to Jack, it was everything. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a new wave of determination. The idea of giving up, of letting go, no longer seemed like an option. He stood up and paced across the room, trying to shake off the uncertainty that had been building inside him. He wasn't going to let Shadow down again. He wouldn't allow the dog who had given his all to face this kind of end. No, Shadow deserved a chance. But the pressure was mounting. As the days ticked by, Jack continued to face pushback from the shelter. The deadline was drawing near, and even though Margaret had given them a week, it was clear she was already skeptical. He had a week to prove that he could give Shadow the life he deserved, but the reality was, Shadow's health was deteriorating fast. Lisa had continued to help, but even her optimism was starting to falter. It was becoming harder to ignore the fact that Shadow's body was simply too broken. His joints weren't responding to the medication, and his appetite was unpredictable. At times, Shadow would refuse to eat, lying still for hours, only lifting his head when Jack approached. And Jack could see it, the struggle in Shadow's eyes, the constant battle against his own body. As the week came to an end, Jack found himself standing outside in the cool morning air, staring at the horizon, unsure of what to do next. He had given everything. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the life they had fought for wasn't one Shadow could truly enjoy? "Maybe we should let him go," Lisa said quietly, coming up behind him. Her voice was heavy with exhaustion, but it was clear that she wasn't just talking about Shadow's care. She was talking about their efforts, too. Maybe it's time. But Jack's heart refused to let that be the answer. He couldn't accept it. Not now. Not after everything Shadow had given him. There had to be a way. He wasn't going to walk away, no matter how hard the road ahead seemed. "Not yet," Jack said, his voice firm. "Not until we've done everything we can." As he spoke, he turned to look back at the house. Shadow was waiting for him inside, and somehow, that felt like enough of a reason to keep fighting. The climax of their battle for Shadow's future was imminent. With every minute that passed, the stakes grew higher. Would they have enough time to find a solution, or had they waited too long? Jack and Lisa both knew that the next few hours would determine everything. The day of reckoning had arrived, and the weight of it hung heavily in the air. Jack sat beside Shadow on the worn couch in his small apartment, his hands resting gently on the dog's head. Shadow had barely moved since the morning, his eyes tired, his breathing shallow, but still steady. Jack could feel the heaviness in his chest. The week was up, and he had done everything he could to prove to the shelter that Shadow still had a chance. But the reality was unavoidable. Shadow was deteriorating rapidly. No matter how much Jack wanted to believe otherwise, he couldn't deny that his old partner was fighting an uphill battle. As the sun began to set outside, Jack stared at the clock, the minutes slipping away faster than he could keep track. He had kept his promise. He had taken care of Shadow, offered him a quiet home, and did everything he could to give him some peace in his final days. But what if it wasn't enough? The shelter would want their answer soon. The rules were clear. If Shadow didn't improve, he would be returned. And the next step was something Jack couldn't even imagine. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling Jack from his thoughts. It was a text from Lisa. "Margaret wants to see you first thing tomorrow. You know what that means." Jack's stomach tightened. Tomorrow. He couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the final decision. But just as he was about to put his phone down, something caught his eye. Something Shadow had done that had not gone unnoticed. The dog had stirred, lifted his head, and was now looking directly at Jack. The flicker of recognition in his eyes was still there, though his body was weak. Shadow's tail moved slightly, just a soft thump against the floor, and that simple gesture sent a jolt of emotion straight through Jack's heart. "Buddy," Jack whispered, unable to hide the lump that formed in his throat. He knew Shadow was tired. He knew the road ahead would be filled with more heartache than Jack was ready to face. But Shadow's eyes, the way they looked at him, steady and full of quiet understanding, made Jack feel like they had one last chance. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Jack stood up, trying to shake off the nervousness that gripped him. He opened it to find Lisa standing there, her face drawn with concern but her eyes determined. She didn't say anything right away, just stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "He's still with you," Lisa said softly, her gaze drifting to Shadow, who now sat up, his body stiff but his posture strong. "For now," Jack replied, his voice tight. "But the clock's ticking." Lisa nodded, sitting down beside him. They both stared at Shadow, the silence between them thick with the weight of the decision that loomed over them. The stakes had never been higher. "I don't know if I can go back to Margaret tomorrow and tell her I haven't seen any improvement," Jack said quietly, his voice breaking a little. "I promised him that I wouldn't let him down. But what if I already have?" Lisa's hand gently rested on his shoulder. "You haven't let him down. You've done more for him than anyone else would. Shadow knows that. He knows you're fighting for him." Jack clenched his fists, fighting back tears. "I don't want to lose him, Lisa. Not like this. He deserves more than to die in a shelter unloved." "Then you keep fighting for him," Lisa replied firmly, her voice full of conviction. "Even if it's just one more day, one more hour. You can't give up now." As they sat in the dimly lit room, the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic breaths of Shadow as he lay back down, his eyes still on Jack. It was as though the old dog was waiting for something, waiting for Jack to make the next move. Then, without warning, Shadow stood up. His legs wobbled beneath him, his joints protesting the movement. But he stood tall. For a moment, Jack thought it was a fluke, perhaps just a moment of strength before the inevitable collapse. But then Shadow moved forward, slowly but purposefully, and stood at Jack's feet, his head nudging against Jack's hand. "Shadow," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt beside the dog, looking into those tired eyes that still held so much trust, so much loyalty. With that single gesture, Shadow had spoken louder than words ever could. He was telling Jack that he wasn't ready to give up. He was showing him that despite the pain, despite the weariness, there was still fight left in him. Jack understood. Shadow had always been more than just a dog. He was a partner, a brother in arms. And now, Shadow was showing him that he still had something to give. "I won't let you down," Jack vowed, his hand resting gently on Shadow's head. "We're in this together, buddy." The next few hours felt like an eternity. Jack and Lisa stayed by Shadow's side, the room filled with the soft hum of the heater and the occasional sound of Shadow's steady breathing. But Jack could feel the change. Something had shifted. There was a spark of life in Shadow that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just hope. It was a sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but Jack knew that for the first time in days, there was something he could hold on to. The undeniable will of his old partner, still fighting, still with him. As the clock struck midnight, Jack stood up, his heart racing with a new sense of determination. Tomorrow was going to be the day that changed everything. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Not yet. They had one more fight to win, and Jack was ready to face whatever it took to give Shadow the life he had earned. The following morning, as dawn broke over the horizon, the weight of the day ahead settled heavily on Jack's shoulders. Shadow lay beside him, still breathing steady but shallow, his body more fragile than Jack had ever seen it. Yet, despite his pain and his aging frame, Shadow seemed different today. There was a flicker of the old spirit in his eyes, the spark of the loyal K9 that had once run alongside Jack through countless dangerous situations. Jack stood at the window, staring out at the rain-soaked street, his mind racing. The clock was ticking. He had to make a decision, and fast. Margaret's deadline was closing in, and he still had no guarantee that she would let Shadow stay with him. There were so many unknowns. Could he provide the care Shadow needed? Would the shelter really honor the promise of a week's reprieve? "Come on, boy," Jack murmured, turning back to Shadow. The dog had risen from his bed, shakily standing on his own four paws. It wasn't easy, but it was a victory in itself. Jack knew it wasn't going to be an easy journey, but this was a sign that there was still hope. The phone buzzed on the counter, and Jack's heart skipped. It was from Lisa. "I'm here. Let's go to the shelter. It's time." Jack's hands trembled as he grabbed the phone. The decision had been made. He had to act now. Together, Jack and Shadow made their way out the door, with Jack guiding him carefully through the apartment, a calm reassurance in every touch. Shadow was still moving slowly, but there was a sense of purpose in the dog's steps, as though he knew what was at stake. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The drive to the shelter felt longer than ever. Jack kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on Shadow, on his promise, on everything he had done to keep him alive. Every second mattered, and Jack couldn't help but feel that this was his last chance to prove that he could keep the promise he made to Shadow all those years ago. When they arrived at the shelter, Jack's nerves were frayed. The familiar building loomed ahead, its cold, impersonal structure reminding him of the harsh reality they were both facing. He could already hear the bustle of activity inside, other dogs barking, the sounds of people moving around, the dull hum of a place that was just doing its job. Lisa was waiting for him outside, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't say anything right away, just nodded toward the door, signaling that they needed to move fast. They entered the shelter together, and Lisa led Jack to the office where Margaret sat, her usual stern expression firmly in place. "Mr. Riley," Margaret greeted him, her voice cool. "I assume you're here to make your final pitch. We've been through this, but let's hear it." Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. Shadow, walking beside him with a steady but slow pace, looked up at Margaret with quiet dignity, his tail tucked slightly, but his eyes alert and steady. "Margaret," Jack said, his voice firm, "I know what the rules are. I know what the shelter's policies say. But you also know who Shadow is, and what he's done. This dog has saved lives, and he's been by my side for years. I owe it to him to give him the rest of his life, even if it's only a few more days or weeks." He paused for a moment, looking at Shadow, who stood by his side with quiet trust. "He's been through so much already. I'm asking you to give him a chance to rest, to heal, and to be loved for however much time he has left. I promise I will give him everything I have." There was a long silence as Margaret studied them both, her gaze moving from Jack to Shadow. Finally, she stood up, crossing her arms. "Let me be clear," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. "If you take him, you're responsible for everything. Every vet bill, every medication, every setback. Shadow's care won't be easy, and if anything goes wrong, he'll be back here." Jack nodded without hesitation. "I understand, and I'm prepared." After a long, tense moment, Margaret finally gave a slight nod. "Fine, but remember, this is your responsibility now. You're sure you can handle it? Jack met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure of much, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to fail Shadow again. I can handle it, Jack said firmly. I'm not giving up on him. Margaret sighed, reaching for the paperwork in front of her. Then signed the release forms, and Shadow's yours. Jack's heart soared. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in days, he felt like they had a fighting chance. Shadow wasn't going to be euthanized. He was going home. As Jack signed the forms, Lisa stood quietly behind him, watching with a small, relieved smile. Shadow, who had stood still during the exchange, now let out a soft, relieved sigh. It was as though he knew the fight was over. Jack helped Shadow up and walked toward the door, the heavy weight on his chest lifting just a little. As they exited the shelter, Jack glanced back one last time, making a silent promise to Shadow. I'm never letting you go again. This was only the beginning of a new chapter. But for now, Shadow was safe, and that was all that mattered. The morning after the decision was made, a new sense of peace had settled over Jack and Shadow. The heavy weight of uncertainty that had hung over them for weeks had lifted, replaced by a quiet but undeniable bond. As they left the shelter, the rain had finally stopped, and the clouds parted, allowing the first rays of sunlight to break through the gray sky. It was a small thing, but it felt like a sign, a fresh start for both of them. Jack carefully loaded Shadow into the back seat of his car, his movements slow and deliberate. Shadow, though stiff from his age, was more alert than Jack had seen him in days. His eyes met Jack's with a flicker of recognition, as if he understood that the road ahead would be different from the one they had just left behind. You're coming home, buddy, Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to make this right. The drive was quiet, filled only with the hum of the engine and the occasional soft breath from Shadow. Jack glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with gratitude and relief. He could hardly believe they were finally out of the shelter, that Shadow had been given a second chance. It was a miracle, a chance for redemption, not just for Shadow, but for himself as well. He had failed his partner once before, but he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. When they arrived at Jack's apartment, Shadow was slow to get out of the car. His legs trembled beneath him, and for a moment, Jack feared the worst. But then, with a quiet determination, Shadow lifted his head and carefully stepped out of the car. It wasn't graceful, and his joints protested the movement, but Shadow was still standing tall. Jack's heart ached for him. He wasn't the same dog he once was, but there was a fire in his eyes, an unmistakable will to live. Jack helped Shadow into the apartment, making sure to guide him carefully as they navigated the unfamiliar space. The apartment was small, cozy, and far from perfect, but it was a home, a place where Shadow could rest, heal, and finally be free of the uncertainty that had haunted him in the shelter. Jack made a soft bed for him by the window, where the sunlight could warm him through the glass. It wasn't much, but it was everything Shadow needed right now. Rest up, buddy, Jack said, his voice full of tenderness as he watched Shadow settle down. You're home. For the next few weeks, life settled into a new routine. Jack kept a careful eye on Shadow, watching for any signs of discomfort, but also celebrating the small victories. Shadow's appetite improved, and slowly, he began to regain some strength. His walks were short, but they were walks nonetheless. Jack made sure to keep the pace slow, giving Shadow the time he needed. But even so, there was something in the dog's step that Jack hadn't seen in months. Purpose. Lisa continued to check in, offering advice and encouragement. She had always believed in Shadow, and now she was there to offer her support as Jack navigated the challenges of caring for a retired K9. The two of them made a great team, and Lisa's optimism kept Jack grounded when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. But despite the progress, there were still moments of doubt. Jack would wake in the middle of the night, his heart racing, worried that he wouldn't be able to keep up with Shadow's care. The vet bills were still piling up, and Jack knew that the costs would continue to rise. But every time Shadow looked at him with those tired but trusting eyes, Jack pushed through. He couldn't give up now. One afternoon, Jack sat on the couch beside Shadow, running his fingers through the dog's fur as they both watched the world outside. Shadow had been with him through so much, through the highs and the lows, through the toughest moments of his life. And now, despite everything that had happened, they were together. Jack had made a promise to Shadow, and he intended to keep it. "You've been through so much," Jack whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "But you're not alone anymore. You've got me." Shadow's tail thumped softly against the floor in response, and Jack couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just the small victories that mattered. It was the fact that they were together, that they had made it through the hardest part. Jack had made mistakes in the past, but he wasn't going to make the same ones again. He would do whatever it took to make sure Shadow had the care he deserved, the comfort he had earned. As the weeks passed, Jack began to notice something amazing. Shadow wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. Slowly but surely, the dog that had been ready to give up, the dog that had howled in sorrow that cold January night, was beginning to come alive again. He had regained some of his old strength. He was playing with Jack, fetching a ball, and wagging his tail more often. It wasn't the same as it had been in the past, but it didn't have to be. Shadow was content, and Jack was content. Jack sat back one evening, watching Shadow curled up by the window, basking in the last of the day's sunlight. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Shadow's health would always be fragile. But in that moment, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Shadow was home, and that was all that mattered. "I'm sorry I let you down before," Jack murmured, his voice soft. "But I'm here now, and I'm never letting you go again." The road ahead would be filled with ups and downs, but Jack knew that, together, they could face anything. They had already overcome so much, and this new chapter of their lives was just beginning. The bond between them, forged through years of service, had only grown stronger. Shadow wasn't just a dog to Jack anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and second chances. And no matter how long or short their time together would be, Jack knew one thing for sure. Shadow had given him the greatest gift of all, redemption. Months passed, and the bond between Jack and Shadow grew stronger with each day. What had started as a desperate attempt to save a dying dog from a cruel fate had blossomed into a journey of healing, both for Shadow and for Jack. The struggles they faced along the way had been far from easy, but together they found a way through. They made a home for each other in the small apartment, where Jack's steady care and Shadow's unwavering loyalty became the foundation of a new life. One afternoon, Jack sat on the couch, his eyes following Shadow as the dog carefully navigated the small living room. Shadow was slower now, his joints creaking with every movement, but there was a new energy in him, a quiet confidence that had been missing for so long. It wasn't the same as before, when Shadow had been a powerful working canine, but it was something Jack had come to appreciate. This was the Shadow who had fought through every hardship and still came out the other side with a heart full of love. And that was enough. "You're a fighter, buddy," Jack said, his voice filled with quiet pride as Shadow stopped beside him. The dog's tail wagged faintly in response, and Jack smiled, reaching out to give Shadow's head a gentle scratch. It had been a long road, one filled with uncertainty, pain, and moments of doubt. But through it all, Jack had come to understand something profound. The life they had together now wasn't just about saving Shadow from the brink of death. It was about redemption. It was about giving Shadow a chance to live out his remaining days in comfort and peace, something that he had earned long ago. And in doing so, Jack had found his own redemption. He had found a purpose that he never thought he would again. There were still challenges, of course. Shadow's health was always a concern, and Jack knew there would be hard days ahead. But for now, in this quiet moment, Jack let himself believe that they had made it. They had fought the system, defied the odds, and emerged victorious. Shadow was not just a survivor. He was a testament to the power of loyalty, love, and second chances. Lisa continued to check in regularly, always bringing advice, encouragement, and the occasional treat for Shadow. She had seen the transformation in both of them and was overjoyed by their progress. The small victories that had once seemed impossible were now everyday occurrences. Jack had learned to care for Shadow in ways he hadn't anticipated, and in doing so, He had grown. He had learned patience, responsibility, and, perhaps most importantly, the true meaning of partnership. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, the setting sun casting a warm golden light across the room, Jack looked down at Shadow, who was curled up contentedly at his feet. The journey had been hard, but the reward was more than worth it. They had faced so much together, and now, for the first time in years, Jack felt at peace. They had a second chance, not just at life, but at healing. "I'm so proud of you, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me what it means to never give up." Shadow's eyes met Jack's, and for a brief moment, it was as if the world stood still. There were no more doubts, no more fears, just the understanding that they had given each other everything they had. Shadow had been there for Jack in ways that Jack could never repay. But in this moment, he realized that the only thing Shadow had ever asked for was love, and Jack had finally given him that. The sun set outside, the room bathed in the soft light of twilight. For Jack and Shadow, this was more than a peaceful evening. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where they would face whatever came their way, side by side, just as they always had. And in that quiet moment, Jack knew one thing for certain. Shadow had given him a second chance at life, and he would never let him go. Together, they were unbreakable,